comparison microscope, or they use DNA, or they use bullet striations. These are really complex terms and sciencey stuff. That it's got to be true. It's got to be true because it's just science and it's so complicated and the people there are so smart. Don't just take it as it is. There are subjective parts to it. Think critically about the evidence that you see, especially when you make reports on it, and the evidence you have to judge upon. So remember this. And the idea of thinking critically, it's not just for this subject here. It's something that you, as a member of today's society, of a civilized society, you have to do that in general. This is off the topic, but you have to think critically about all the information you're given, whether it's from websites or newspapers. If you're in college or educated to that degree, or even if not, don't just think that if someone says it, you should believe it. Don't just think that if they sound smart and they say something, you should believe it. Always think critically. You read an article in a newspaper, don't just believe them. Think about it. An interesting story that happened to me, again, completely off the topic, is what I would consider the best teacher, as a teacher, not as a person, teacher of a class in my college experience, my undergraduate experience. What he did, he was teaching people politics and whatever the subject was. And he would start the course the course would be basically a discussion where he would lead and organize the discussion, but he would start off with an idea. Let's say, I don't know, slavery is good or bad or something, or who knows what. Should we regulate drugs, or whatever the subject might have been. He'd start off with a certain idea that made sense. And he'd say, okay, let's talk about the idea. What do you think about the idea? He'd say, yeah, it's a good idea. We should have laws for this. And he'd say, okay, now let's think about this result. Let's think about this another related idea. And by the time the class would end, everybody who said that the original idea was a good idea, the entire class would be saying, no, it's a bad idea. We have to do something else instead, or we have to do something the opposite. That's the way he taught. Like, we were at first convinced of something, but we were suddenly not convinced of it. And he taught us, think critically. Just because something's idea makes sense does not mean you should believe it. Think, because sometimes there's a reason it should not be true. This class came to a very this idea in this class. The most indicative of his abilities was the question at first was, should we teach that in this case it was a race question, that the Negroid race, whatever you want to call it, Africoid, Negroid, whatever the term is, the Africoid race, should it be taught in schools the idea that they are inferior in intelligence? Okay, that was the question. So we were divided into groups to discuss it, back and forth, and ideas why not, the benefits, disadvantages, whatever it might have been. And so I said, okay, so what did you come up with? And the group I was in the one who represented us was a black African American who was certainly of the Negroid or Africoid race. And he said, absolutely not. This should definitely not be taught. Okay, reasonable thing to say. And he kept on talking, and the teacher kept on talking to him and saying, okay, why do you think so? What is it? Why would, what about this idea? What about this? And by the time he finished talking to this representative of our group, he had this black African American admitting and saying, yes, it actually could be a good idea to teach that the Africoid or Negroid race is inferior in intelligence. That's how good this teacher was. But the basic idea that I'm trying to tell you is not just for forensics. Think critically. You hear something, don't just absorb it and think it's, for whatever reason, it's sciencey or it's smart or someone smart said so that you have to trust it and believe it. think about it yourself, analyze it yourself, and only then come up with an idea. If you haven't done that, your opinion is lacking something. Anyway, getting back to the course of forensics, let's talk about automated forensic databases. Now, if we had files on every single person on the planet, then we find evidence connecting evidence, we can connect it to every single person, any individual person on the planet. Now, we don't have that, but we have databases of a lot of people. So the two main ones for you to know about are the IAFIS and the CODIS, the CODIS. Now, this is for fingerprints. The Integrated Automatic Fingerprint Identification System. What this does is it enables people to connect fingerprints found at crime scenes to fingerprints in this database. Now, who gets into the database? Well, pretty much anyone we can put in there. All criminals, they get fingerprinted and they can put in the database. We do this to anyone detained by the police. So if we ever see a crime scene where there's a fingerprint, get that fingerprint, send it, compare it to whatever's in the IAFIS, however you want to call it, put it there, and it'll spit back a name. It's not that simple, but it'll narrow it down, and we can get a name, so we can know exactly who was at the crime scene. Very, very useful. But we have to have a database of all kinds of fingerprints, and all different people are in the Bay database. At this point, only 75 million, but and incidentally, not a single one of these 75 million is the same. So it's a lot of people, but most of us who have never done any crime, the police have never seen, never knew anything about, don't have any fingerprints in there. But criminals do. And so if any one of these criminals left a fingerprint behind, we will find them and we will identify them. DNA, the CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Very, very useful for catching people. People leave DNA all over the place. Whether when they touch things, when they bite things, when they rub against things. So if we have DNA for a lot of people, and then we will pretty much, I can't say we will, but very often we find DNA at the crime scene, we'll know exactly what's at the crime scene by matching it or trying to match it with the DNA in the CODIS. So it's a very good idea to actually collect DNA from as many people as possible. And anyone detained by police can have their DNA sampled. Immigrants also, whether legal or illegal. These immigrants are, we take their DNA by doing a buccal swab. It's something where you take some kind of Q-tip-like thing, you swab the inside of their cheeks, and you got the DNA from them, and you put that on file. You analyze the DNA and you put it on file. So immigrants will have this. So if an immigrant is causing any crime and left DNA behind, we will find them. So that's the idea of the DNA database. It's very important because DNA, it changed the way crime is forensically analyzed, because almost anyone, it's very common to leave DNA behind, and therefore it's a clue for almost any crime. So we're going to look at all crimes through the idea of, did they leave DNA behind, and where did we get it from? So we have a method called rapid DNA, where we can just swab their cheek. It's called a buccal swab. We swab their inside of their cheek. We send it to them. They put